The clink of glasses and soft murmur of conversation filled the grand dining room of the Whitmore residence in Mayfair. Gold-rimmed plates gleamed beneath the chandelier's warm glow, and the scent of truffle oil lingered in the air. Everything looked perfect. To anyone observing, Sarah Whitmore had the ideal life, a townhouse in one of London's most exclusive postcodes, a successful husband, and a seat at every influential table in the city. But beneath the sparkle and civility of the evening, something festered. George, her husband of 12 years, was holding court at the far end of the table, charming their guests with his usual bravado. Dressed in his tailored navy suit and sipping claret from a crystal glass, he spoke with the confident drawl of a man used to being listened to. Seated next to him was Andre, George's younger brother and business partner, his laughter just a touch too loud. Sarah sat opposite, her posture graceful, her smile polite. Her startup had just landed a feature in a major business journal that morning. But as she began to explain the article to Beatrice Langley, their well-heeled neighbor, George's voice sliced through the air. "Oh, darling, please don't bore everyone with your little project," he said with a chuckle. "We're here to enjoy ourselves, not talk about side hobbies." A few nervous laughs followed. Sarah felt the heat rise to her cheeks. Beatrice's fork paused mid-air. George added, "She's brilliant at spending time and money, less so at turning it into something worthwhile." It wasn't the first time George had diminished her, but never so publicly. Sarah caught Andre's gaze. He looked away. "I suppose I'll leave the profitable businesses to you then, George," Sarah said quietly, voice steady despite the storm building inside. She excused herself, crossing the room in silence as conversations resumed with an uneasy air. In the hallway, she paused by the mirror, smoothing her dress. Her reflection stared back, composed, elegant, but stung. For years, Sarah had supported George through thick and thin, hosting dinners, managing appearances, playing the role of the perfect wife. But now, with her company finally gaining traction, he treated her success as nothing more than a passing hobby. She walked upstairs to her office, where the soft blue light of her laptop beckoned. She opened her inbox. The headline was still there, "Mayfair Mum builds tech startup that's turning heads in the fintech world." George didn't see it yet. But the world was starting to. And that changed everything. The next morning, Sarah stood in her kitchen, staring out at the quiet streets of Mayfair. The air was crisp, the sun bright as it filtered through the large bay windows of their townhouse. But inside, she felt a tight knot in her stomach. George's words still echoed in her mind, along with the dismissive looks he had exchanged with their guests the night before. She busied herself with a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the feeling of inadequacy. But it lingered, like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. Just as she was about to sit down at the kitchen table, her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Sarah Whitmore." The voice on the other end was calm, yet authoritative. "Yes, this is she. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm James Foster from the London Business Network. I came across your recent article, and I must say, I'm quite impressed with what you're building. We'd like to discuss a potential partnership. Can we meet?" Sarah blinked, her pulse quickening. A partnership. She had always imagined her business scaling up, but the prospect of an actual partnership with someone outside her circle felt almost unreal. But she quickly masked her surprise with professionalism. "That sounds wonderful. When would be convenient for you?" she asked, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of excitement. "Tomorrow afternoon. I'll send you the details." After ending the call, Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her mind raced with possibilities. She had worked so hard to build her company. And now, someone with real influence wanted to invest. But as her thoughts wandered, she couldn't shake the unease creeping in. George hadn't been supportive of her business ventures before. How would he react when he found out about this potential partnership? Would he belittle it again? Or would this be the moment that made him see her as more than just his wife, more than just the woman who managed their social calendar and household? The phone buzzed again, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a text from Beatrice Langley, the neighbor who had been at dinner last night. "Sarah, darling, I wanted to apologize for George's behavior last night. I know you've worked so hard. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." For a brief moment, Sarah felt a wave of relief. Beatrice's words were like a balm, offering comfort that she hadn't expected. But the relief was short-lived as Sarah quickly reminded herself of the bigger picture. She was building something important, something that no one, least of all George, could diminish. The following day, Sarah prepared for her meeting with James Foster. She chose a sleek, navy blue dress that made her feel confident, standing in front of the mirror as she adjusted her look. Her heart pounded with anticipation, but she steadied herself. This was her moment to prove herself, to show George that she could build something on her own, without relying on his approval. As she walked out of the house, she glanced over her shoulder at the townhouse, unsure whether George would even notice she was leaving. They had become increasingly distant, their conversations awkward, as if they were living parallel lives under the same roof. Despite the tension, she felt a surge of resolve. The meeting with James went better than expected. He was sharp, professional, and seemed genuinely interested in her vision. They talked for hours, discussing potential strategies and how their combined efforts could revolutionize a part of the industry. By the end of the meeting, Sarah was both exhausted and exhilarated. She could already see the possibilities, the doors this partnership could open. But as she drove back to Mayfair, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping back in. The success of the meeting was overshadowed by the thought of George's reaction. Would he even care? Would he be supportive, or would he dismiss her once again? When she arrived home, she found George in the study, his back turned as he reviewed papers. The moment Sarah stepped into the room, he glanced up, giving her a curt nod. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I had a meeting today," she began, her voice measured but tinged with anxiety. "It went really well. There's potential for a partnership that could take my business to the next level." George put down his papers, his gaze unwavering. He didn't seem particularly interested, but his lips curled into a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's nice, darling," he said, his tone nonchalant. "But I really think you should focus on what you're good at. Let's not get too carried away." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the familiar sting of dismissal creeping back. For a moment, she simply stood there, her thoughts spinning. She had hoped, no, expected, more. But this was the same reaction she had faced time and time again. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned and walked out of the study, her heart heavy. She needed a moment to gather her thoughts, to recalibrate. But as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she realized something. It didn't matter what George thought. She had just taken a huge step forward. And that was all that mattered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Beatrice again. "Sarah, I know you're dealing with a lot right now, but remember, you're doing something amazing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a spark of hope. Beatrice's words, although simple, were a reminder that she wasn't alone. She had allies, people who believed in her and her vision. She was ready to face whatever came next. The following week passed in a blur for Sarah. She had spent her days immersed in the potential partnership, crafting ideas, and making plans. But her nights were a different story. At home, the silence between her and George was becoming unbearable. He rarely spoke to her unless it was absolutely necessary. Their once easygoing conversations had dwindled to cold exchanges. And yet, despite the emotional distance, she couldn't ignore the feeling of guilt that gnawed at her whenever she thought of him. One evening, Sarah returned home late from a business dinner. She had been out networking, discussing her growing venture with a group of potential investors. As she entered the townhouse, she found George sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look up as she stepped in, his face blank and unreadable. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to address the tension that had been building for days or simply retreat to her own space. But something within her stirred, a desire to break the silence that had begun to suffocate her. "George," she started, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." He didn't respond at first, his eyes fixed on the fireplace. But after a long, heavy pause, he finally looked up at her. "About what?" His tone was flat, almost indifferent. Sarah sat down across from him, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could feel her heart racing as she spoke, but she refused to back down. "About us. About everything. I can't keep pretending that things are fine when they're not. I can't keep carrying the weight of this on my own." George's expression remained unreadable. He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch between them before he responded. "You're the one who's changed, Sarah. You're the one who's become so wrapped up in your work, your business, that you don't even notice what's happening right in front of you." The words stung, but Sarah held her ground. "I'm trying to build something for myself, George. I'm trying to prove that I can be more than just your wife, more than just someone who takes care of things at home. And I need you to understand that. I need you to support me, not tear me down." George looked at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and distant. "I don't need you to prove anything to me, Sarah. I just need you to be here, to be with me. You've been so focused on your career, you've forgotten about us. You've forgotten about me." Sarah's chest tightened as his words sank in. She knew, deep down, that there was truth in them. She had been so consumed by her own ambition that she had failed to see how much distance had grown between them. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the fact that George had never fully supported her ambitions. He had never seen her for more than just a wife and mother. "I can't keep living like this," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending that I don't have dreams of my own." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words and emotions that neither of them knew how to express. Finally, George set his glass down on the coffee table, his hands resting on his knees as he looked at her. "Do what you need to do, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But don't expect me to wait around forever." His words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. The finality in his tone, the coldness in his eyes, it was all too much. She stood up, her hands trembling as she forced herself to walk away from him. She needed to breathe, to think. She needed to find herself again, even if it meant walking away from everything she had known. The days following her confrontation with George felt like a constant tug-of-war for Sarah. At work, she was more determined than ever to prove herself. Her passion for the business had never been stronger, and she threw herself into meetings and planning with unmatched focus. But at home, the weight of her marriage continued to press down on her, suffocating her every step. One evening, as Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing the latest figures for her business, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, not expecting anything urgent. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Richard. She hadn't heard from him in years. Richard, her first love, the one who had left her broken-hearted all those years ago. They had met in university, shared dreams and whispered promises. But when Sarah had made the decision to move to London, Richard had chosen a different path. He had married someone else and settled down. Sarah, devastated, had buried her feelings and thrown herself into her career, pushing aside any thoughts of him. But now, his name flashed across her screen. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Richard had been a chapter in her life she had long since closed. But curiosity got the better of her, and she tapped the screen to answer. Sarah, Richard's voice on the other end was familiar and comforting, yet distant. I know this might be unexpected, but I've been thinking about you. I'm back in London, and I was wondering if we could meet. Her mind raced. What could he possibly want after all these years? Had he been through his own share of struggles? Or was this simply a moment of nostalgia for him? I don't know if it's a good idea, Richard, Sarah replied, her voice hesitant. I've been busy with work and other things. But Richard pressed on. I understand, but I just need to see you. I owe you an explanation. We never really had closure, did we? The words lingered in the air between them, and Sarah found herself swallowing the lump in her throat. Closure. That word echoed in her mind. Was this really something she needed, something she wanted? I'll meet you, she finally said, surprising herself with her own decision. But only for a coffee. That's it. She ended the call with a sense of uncertainty that she couldn't shake. What had she just agreed to? She hadn't seen Richard in years, but something inside her felt like she needed to. As she set the phone down, a wave of unease washed over her. The next day, Sarah found herself walking into a small cafe near her office, her stomach tight with nerves. She hadn't even realized how much she had missed the familiar comfort of being around Richard. But now, as she waited at the table, she wasn't sure if it was the nostalgia or the unresolved feelings that were making her heart race. She looked up as the door opened, and there he was, Richard. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still with that slightly messy hair that had always made her smile. The same eyes that had once looked at her with such love now held a glimmer of something different. Something she couldn't quite place. Sarah, he greeted her with a soft smile. It's good to see you. She nodded, forcing a smile in return. It's been a long time, hasn't it? They sat down, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Richard ordered a coffee, and they began to talk, tentatively at first, catching up on the years that had passed. Sarah learned about his wife, his children, his life in the countryside. But the conversation always seemed to circle back to them, to the past, and to the feelings that had never quite gone away. I've thought about you, Sarah, Richard admitted one evening as they sat together, the sun beginning to set. More than I'd like to admit. I know I hurt you, and I regret that every day. But I had to let you go. I thought it was the right thing to do at the time. Sarah could feel her heart tightening. She had spent so many years burying her emotions, telling herself she had moved on. But here, in the presence of Richard, everything that had once been so important to her came rushing back. I didn't want to let you go, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But you left me, Richard. You chose your life over us. The words hung in the air, heavy with years of unanswered questions and longing. Richard reached across the table, taking her hand in his touch warm and comforting. I know, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, Sarah. I'm here because I don't want to keep living with this regret. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Was she ready to open herself up to him again? Was she ready to face the feelings she had hidden for so long? And more importantly, was she ready to risk everything, her marriage, her business, her future, for a second chance with Richard? The days following her meeting with Richard felt like an emotional whirlwind for Sarah. She couldn't shake the thoughts of him from her mind. The image of his familiar face, the weight of his words, and the touch of his hand still lingered in her thoughts like a ghost from the past. The connection that had once been so strong, now resurfaced with a force that she wasn't prepared for. Her phone rang again, and she looked at it with hesitation. It was Richard once more. She had been avoiding his calls, telling herself that she needed time to process everything. But her curiosity, her old feelings for him, kept pulling her in. She answered. Sarah, Richard's voice came through the line, steady but urgent. I've been thinking about our conversation. I can't just leave things as they are. I need to know if we can make this work. If we can find a way back to what we had. Sarah felt a tight knot in her stomach. She had never thought she would be in this position. Her life was supposed to be stable. Her marriage, her career, everything was on track. Yet here she was, torn between a past she thought she had buried and a present that was slipping through her fingers. I don't know what to say, Richard, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I have a family, a life here. My business, my marriage, it's all I've worked for. But don't you feel it, Sarah? The spark is still there, Richard pressed. I know it's complicated, but we can't ignore what's between us. You know it, and I know it. A silence fell between them, one that stretched on for far too long. Sarah felt like she was suffocating, caught between two worlds that no longer made sense. Could she walk away from the life she had built with George, from the family she had fought so hard to create, for something that felt like a fleeting moment from her past? She wanted to say something, anything that would make sense of it all, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind raced, spinning through the options in her head, each one more complicated than the last. Her heart told her one thing, but her head screamed at her to be rational, to not throw away everything she had worked for. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I need time, Richard. I need time to think about everything. This isn't something I can just decide on a whim. Of course, Richard replied softly. Take all the time you need. But just know that I'm here. I always have been. The call ended, but the weight of his words stayed with her. Sarah sat there for a moment, staring at her phone, feeling as though everything she had known was slipping through her fingers. How could she possibly make a decision like this? How could she choose between the life she had built and the life she once dreamed of? Later that night, after dinner, Sarah sat across from George in their quiet living room. The weight of her conversation with Richard still hung heavily in her mind. She had told herself she would take some time to think, but the truth was, she was already conflicted. George, as always, was distracted. He was scrolling through his phone, barely looking up as Sarah tried to gather her thoughts. She had always been the one to put their marriage first, to support George's career and their family. But now, with Richard back in the picture, everything had changed. George, she began, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty, there's something I need to talk to you about. He looked up briefly, his eyes tired. What's wrong, Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost. She hesitated for a moment, not sure how to put it into words. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted to say. But she knew she had to say something, even if it meant shattering the fragile sense of security they had built over the years. It's about Richard, she said quietly. He's back in London, and he wants to meet again. He says there's unfinished business between us. George's face darkened, a look of disbelief crossing his features. Richard? After all these years? Why would he even reach out to you now? Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know, George. But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me and him. It's about me figuring out what I want. What I need. George's expression faltered, his eyes narrowing. So, what is it, Sarah? Do you want to go back to him? Is that it? The accusation hung in the air like a knife, and Sarah felt her stomach twist. No, that's not it, she said quickly. I don't know what I want yet. But I need space to figure it out. I need you to respect that. The room grew heavy with tension as George sat back, rubbing his forehead. I don't know what to say, Sarah. I thought we had everything we needed. I thought you were happy. I am happy, Sarah replied, her voice soft but firm. But sometimes happiness isn't enough. Sometimes, you need to know who you really are, apart from everything else. George didn't say anything else, but Sarah could feel the distance growing between them. There was so much left unsaid, so much that needed to be addressed. And as she sat there, she knew that whatever choice she made, it would change everything. The next few days felt like a blur for Sarah. Every time she tried to focus on work, on her business, her thoughts were clouded by the weight of her conversations with Richard. She couldn't seem to escape it. The question kept resurfacing: what did she want? She had been so sure of her path before, but now everything seemed uncertain. One evening, as she sat in her home office, staring at her computer screen, her phone buzzed once again. Richard. This time, she didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone and answered quickly, as if doing so would stop the thoughts from consuming her. Sarah, Richard's voice was urgent but calm. I've been thinking a lot. I know you need space, but I can't just sit here waiting. I need you to know that I'm serious about us. I want to build something again. With you. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected him to be so direct, so adamant. She felt torn. Her heart ached for the past, for the connection they had shared, but her mind screamed at her to remember the life she had built with George. I don't know what to say, Richard, Sarah replied, her voice shaky. Everything is so complicated now. My life here, my family, how can I just walk away from it all? You don't have to walk away from everything, Sarah, Richard said softly. I'm not asking you to leave your life behind. I'm asking you to take a chance. To see if we can still have what we once had. Sarah's head spun. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain some sense of control. She couldn't believe this was happening. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. She had always prided herself on making decisions quickly, but this was different. Richard, I need time, Sarah said, her voice firm now, though her heart was anything but. I need time to think. I can't make any decisions right now. I understand, Richard said, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice. Take all the time you need. But please, don't shut me out completely. The call ended, and Sarah sat there in the silence that followed. The decision that had been weighing on her for days now felt heavier than ever. What was she supposed to do? Her heart still felt drawn to Richard, but her loyalty to George and the life they had built together kept pulling her back. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. She looked over at George, who was already asleep, his face peaceful and unaware of the storm brewing inside her. She had been living with this secret, with this growing tension, for far too long. But how could she confront him? How could she tell him the truth about everything? The next morning, George seemed distracted, lost in his thoughts as they sat down for breakfast. Sarah watched him, noting the familiar lines of worry on his face. She had always admired George's ability to stay calm in the face of stress, but today, something felt different. There was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. George, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, is everything okay? You've been off lately. He looked up, surprised by her question. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, slowly, he spoke. I've been thinking about us, Sarah, he said quietly. About everything that's been going on. I can feel that something's off. And I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like you're pulling away from me. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. This was it. The breaking point. The moment she had been dreading. I don't know what to say, George, she began, struggling to find the right words. There's a lot going on in my head right now. I've been trying to figure things out, but I'm not sure how to fix things. George set his coffee cup down and looked at her with concern. Is this about the business? Are you worried about it? Or is there something else? Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The truth was, she wasn't sure what she was worried about. There were too many things, too many emotions, too many choices. I'm not worried about the business, George, she said softly. I don't know. I feel lost. Like I'm stuck between two worlds. For a moment, George didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. And in that silence, Sarah knew that she couldn't keep hiding from the truth anymore. The tension in Sarah's mind was unbearable. The moment had arrived, the moment she had been dreading. The weight of her emotions, her choices, it was all leading to this. The air in the room felt thick with uncertainty, and as she looked at George, she knew that the truth could no longer stay hidden. It was the first time in weeks that they had both truly sat down together, without distractions, without the chaos of their daily lives getting in the way. It felt like the last chance to fix things. Or to finally let go. George continued to stare at her, waiting for an answer. But Sarah had no answer. There were no easy words for the complexity of what she was feeling. I'm not sure where we go from here, George, Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can keep pretending everything is fine. It's not just about the business. It's about us. I've been so confused, and I think I've been running away from facing the truth. George's expression softened, but his eyes still held the edge of concern. Sarah, whatever's going on, we can work through it. You don't have to do this alone. But Sarah knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about working through their problems together. It wasn't just about George. It was about her. Her desires. Her future. And what she wanted now. Richard called me again, she said, her voice breaking slightly as she said his name. He said he wanted to try again. He's serious, George. He wants me back. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's heart raced, unsure of how George would react. She had braced herself for anger, for disappointment. But when George finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly calm. I figured as much, he said softly. I knew something wasn't right. I've seen the way you look at him when you talk about him. I'm not blind, Sarah. Her heart sank as she heard the sadness in his voice. She had never meant to hurt him. But now it felt like the truth was out, and the consequences of her actions were unavoidable. I didn't want to hurt you, George, Sarah whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was scared of losing you, but I couldn't ignore how I felt either. George didn't reply right away. He just sat there, looking at her, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. Sarah, I love you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But I can't keep living in a relationship where you're not fully here. You deserve to be with someone who makes you happy. And I deserve the same. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she listened to his words. It was painful, more painful than she had imagined. She had always thought that love would be enough to keep them together, but now she understood that love, while powerful, could not force happiness. Are we ending this? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. George nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. I think we've already ended it, Sarah. We just haven't admitted it yet. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah sat there, struggling to absorb everything that had just been said. The life she had built with George, the family they had created, was slipping away before her eyes. But in that moment, as the weight of their reality settled in, she knew that this was the only way forward. She took a deep breath, her heart heavy with grief, but also with a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally facing the truth. I'm sorry, George, Sarah whispered again, her voice breaking. I truly am. George reached over and gently took her hand, his grip firm but tender. I know, Sarah. And I'm sorry too. And as the room fell into silence, Both of them knew that this was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another.